We're now standing in the Great Circle, which is fairly grand as it is, but if it had been built in accordance with the original plans, it would have been even grander, because in the two gaps on the east and west side of the circle there would have been two very large chapels, making 3 chapels in total, because we still have the chapel that was built in the southern end of the circle behind us. These ones in the gaps would have been built to look a little bit like the Parthenon in Athens, sort of Greek temple style, and would have been probably twice as big as the chapel that we now have, if the plans are correct. The other difference between the original plans and what we have today is that in the original plans the circle was to be totally empty, and it stayed that way for 50 years until a gentleman called Monsieur Canet, who was working for Queen Victoria, let it be known that he wished to be buried in the circle. And she told the cemetery this, and they said, well, sorry, Your Majesty, but we don't bury people in the circle. And she made it plain that they did now. So Monsieur Canet was in. And once he was in, everybody, about everybody, wanted to be buried in the circle. And so we end up with what we have today, which is a lot of rather similar monuments and similar graves, because there was a tremendous sell-off of sites in the circle at that time. In addition to Monsieur Canet, who's over by the south end of the circle, as an interesting character, having started it all, we have a very unusual gentleman in the gap on the east side, and on his monument he has a large wolf, and that's for a very simple reason, that his name was Chief Longwolf, an unusual name. He was an American Indian, and he came across with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, first of all for Queen Victoria's 50th anniversary in 1887, and then by popular demand on a couple of occasions afterwards. And sadly, he died of scarlet fever during one of his follow-up visits, and was buried over there by arrangement with the Buffalo Bill Cody family, who bought the plot. Alongside him was buried a little baby who sadly was with one of the American Indian families who came across to be in that show, and she died as well. So she and Longwolf were buried in there. Some years ago someone pointed out that it was very unlucky for them to be buried so far away from their homeland. So a group of people got together and disinterred them and flew them back to the Dakota Hills, where they are now buried happily. One of the families that was involved in that lost their son, so he's now buried in that plot. Another interesting lady who's buried in the circle is one of the Roosevelt family, and she has one of the most lovely statues in the cemetery. She married an Italian aristocrat called the Marquis Macchetta, so she became Marquis Blanche Roosevelt Macchetta. She had aspirations as a musician, which didn't quite work out, and indeed as an author, and that didn't quite work out, but she lived very happily, but rather briefly. She died when she was 40 years old as the Marquesa Blanche Roosevelt Macchetta.